You so much for joining us for our Introduction to Art Collecting webinar today, led by the lovely Valerie. Valerie has been a photography specialist and dealer for nearly 10 years, 4 of them at the Hamilton's Gallery, so there will be a ton of valuable information shared today. If you want to grab a pen and paper, that's absolutely fine, and to talk will be about 25-30 minutes, and feel free to submit the questions in the Q&A throughout the talk, and also if you just want to write them down on your paper, that's absolutely fine as well. We'll make sure that we answer everything at the end. We wanted to make sure that there is a bigger chunk of time for Q&A, because there's always best that way. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy, ladies, and over to you, Valerie.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining me. As Christina said, I've been a specialist for over 10 years now, and my specialty is photography. So a lot of this presentation will have photography-based analogies, but please feel free to ask me about other artworks later on. Hopefully I'll be able to answer some of your questions, and I will try to keep the presentation itself quite concise, so that there's time for more anecdotes and stories, and even if you just want to ask about fun experiences, we can do it that way as well. And I'm going to kind of ignore the chat for a bit during the talk, but Christina said that she would warn me if there was anything that really needed clarification, and I could circle back and clarify that. So that being said, let me share my screen and start us off. I hope everyone can see that. So here we are. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. And I wanted to start this presentation by saying that art is really not beyond your reach. There really wouldn't be any point in my having this presentation with you if I thought that it was. I had a conversation early on over lockdown with a collector client of mine, and he was ranting and raving about how he was getting offered all of these beautiful pictures, but they were just asking for, or rather offering better deals for things that he had already seen. And one of the things he kept circling back to was that people that were just starting out, or people who had lower budgets, were getting offered way more interesting things that were much more creative within that budget sector. Now, given that it's slightly endearing that he would make this kind of complaint, given the amount of money he can actually invest in artwork, that aside, I think he actually brought up a real truth and a valid point. So I thought I'd start off talking from that perspective, that there really are unique occasions and unique opportunities that are afforded to people that are just starting out. So I hope after this, when you explore the art world, you get that experience. That being said, you do need to spend some time exploring the options that you have. And I find that a really useful way of starting is understanding what kind of priorities you might have in starting to buy art, even if it's just one piece. I've broken it down into 4 types of priorities or perspectives of collecting, if you prefer. The first is one of the ones that comes to mind immediately. It's the financial investment in collecting art. And it's my least favorite focal point, really, because there's a tendency to believe that the art market is the last unregulated market, and that it's in a state of permanent appreciation. And really, there's absolutely no guarantees of that. In fact, the art market is actually quite risk averse, and it thrives less on the incentive of financial investment and more on the cultivation that artwork endures in private hands. And I'll give several examples of where I believe that to be true later in the presentation. But really, it's just important to know that there are really no guarantees in this, and art is also meant to give you value over time, rather than you gaining value in flipping, which is a term we use for selling on artwork quite quickly. One of the examples that I can give about how this really doesn't work when it's your only motivation is art funds. And there have been a few. generally, there were a number that popped up right before the financial crisis, and I don't really know of too many that are active today that aren't diversified in other ways. But generally, we found that, or at least in my experience and the ones that I know of, these really didn't end up being very successful, especially when they had fixed term divestment strategies. So before I move on, please remember this owl. He comes back later in the presentation. The second is passion, and that's pretty self-explanatory. So instead of delving into that in great detail, I'll tell you that the illustration I chose to use was an Herb Ritts print that I own. I fell in love with this print. It motivates me every day. I mean, who wouldn't want to just feel like that every morning? I really just am absolutely head over heels for it. So I thought I'd share it with you all. I also make this point and kind of say that passion is my favorite perspective that most good collections start from, because it's my experience over time that the collectors that I see that have grown, that have developed their sense of taste and of focus, and who have really just picked out really beautiful things, they all started from this perspective, and it made all the difference in how they developed in later priorities they might have for their collection. Which brings me to the third perspective, and that is learning. There are quite a number of collections, even small ones, very diversified ones, in fact, that cultivate theses or explore themes in greater depth. And that could be anything from, a type of color or black and white, or a process, or a theme that you see pictured. So in this particular illustration, you'll see that I've chosen a press release from 2012 of a sale of the collection of Henry Bull. And he chose to focus his photography collection on hands in love, this sort of palm to palm and lovers' hands do touch type of thing, but also hands in physical labor, and hands grieving, and hands mourning. And what you got was this incredible collection and presentation of a really fundamental human thing. We all express ourselves. I'm doing it a little bit too much right now, I realize, with our hands. And what ended up happening over time is that, especially after he published a book of the collection, is that we began to see how photography in particular, and probably also sculpture and painting, there are many examples of how art does this across the mediums, but when it comes specifically to photography, where hands became a form of self-portrait. There's a really great example of pictures by a photographer named Mr. Irving Penn, who took photographs of Miles Davis's, the jazz musician's hands. He was a trumpet player. And when you see his hands gesticulating in the form of his instrument, it becomes a portrait of the artist himself and of his music. So we sort of learned how photography could do that. And what ended up happening with the sale was that individual prints that normally were not going for very much money actually did very, very well, because as a whole, they became part of a collection that taught humans and art history something that hadn't been explored before. And that's not to put pressure on anyone. Sometimes buying a piece of art is really, like I said before, just falling in love, or being a huge fan of something. But there are other instances where we get curious and art makes us think. And I think exploring that in greater detail is really a valuable way to take on the journey of collecting, if you will. And then there's posterity. And posterity is really about safeguarding artwork. Now, that often is a priority that might come later in the collecting process, but it's something that I think everyone should be aware of as a sort of an evolutionary perspective of collecting. So here what I've chose to illustrate is the new wing of the Tate Modern. Most people don't know this angle of it. I don't know if anyone is joining us from outside the UK, but this is indeed what it looks like at night, and it's truly beautiful. But aside from being just a simple British PR exercise, this wing was meant to house new and promised gifts. And those gifts often were coming from small collections of artwork. And granted, there are plenty of reasons to donate to a museum or to promise a gift to museums. In the case of people from the United States and various other countries, there are tax incentives. But at the end of the day, the question becomes, where does this beautiful group of works that I've put together end up going? And equally, how am I currently safeguarding it? And I just think it's a really nice perspective of seeing how even small collections can evolve. I think one of the things I mentioned in the description of this talk today was that there are elements of this talk that might cross over into the luxury goods market, or how you buy cars, or even how you think about investing in your home and decorating your home and creating this environment that's personal to you. At some point, it becomes about being a custodian of these objects and of making them part of this small journey that we have on this planet. And I just think it's a really nice way of exploring that. Also, the Victoria and Albert Museum currently has a Macintosh computer in a glass case as a historical object. So you really never know. Anything that you buy might actually become really relevant to history as part of humans' evolution and cultural evolution. So don't discount the importance of even buying a small piece of artwork. And the next sort of stage in what I think is sort of the journey of starting to collect is understanding objects. So I'm going to go through these slides with perspectives and themes of things to ask about, but please remember that all of these things are not necessarily things that you need to know the answers to as you start to explore. They're things that should be questions that you think of asking, and hopefully some of these examples will provide some sort of context. But in the Q&A, I'm hoping that you surprise me with a ton more, because they could be infinite. But I'm going to focus on the most important ones. The first is age. Even if you're looking at a print that was made by someone a year ago or yesterday or 10 years ago, it's important to know exactly what that means. So it could be a young artist who's just making prints now, and that's perfectly fine. But especially if you're looking at work that was made quite a long time ago, of which there could be several different iterations, you can ask things like, is it from the right period of the artist, or a period that you would appreciate? Is it a reinterpretation of an earlier work? Is the artwork new, or was it already done that way before? There can be objects which are sort of reimagined later that look very similar to earlier works, and making the distinction is really important. Now, the answer to all of these questions might be a positive or a negative, depending on the answer that you get. So for instance, if I am looking at an auction and I see that there's a photograph that was made by Henri Cartier-Bresson, for instance, and I realize that it was printed later than when he took the image, that might seem to be less valuable, but actually what I know about the prints made at that time is that Henri stopped making his own pictures, and he gave that responsibility to someone who was much better at printing pictures. And what I know what I assume I'm going to get before asking further questions is actually a better made print versus things that might have been made directly in the photographer's studio at that time. So I hope that gives an interesting example of where the logic of the age of the work, or where it's positioned in the artist's career, might not be what you assume to be good or bad. It's just an answer that you need to know before moving on. And you'll learn these things over time and make your own assessments as to what are things that you find important for particular artists or particular genres of artwork. One really important question to ask is the artwork made in the artist's lifetime? And what we call this, if an artwork is made after the artist has passed, whether or not the person making it has the permission, we call this posthumous printing or casting or making of artwork. Generally, this is frowned upon. There are certain instances where it might be less frowned upon. And I can give some examples in the Q&A of some interesting photographers that have managed to keep their market alive with posthumous prints. The next is cataloging. Cataloging is all of the information you find on an artwork. So for this, I've illustrated one of the most detailed types of cataloging, where the photographer has not only signed the picture. If you zoom in on your computers, you'll see that there's a very detailed title. There's the date of the negative, the number of the negative, the process, the type of toning that the photographer used on the print. Basically, he does my job for me. And it would seem super logical for any artist or photographer to give all this information, if not on the artwork itself, because in the case of sculpture, it would be nearly impossible to do, but at least to the gallerist. That is not often the case. So in all of the information that you can find, more is always more. Where there are big gaps in information, that's always a bit of a red flag, or at least begs some sort of explanation as to why the person selling the artwork doesn't know the answer to those questions. So keep that in mind. Then there's also, there is provenance and pedigree. And by that, I mean, books in which the artwork might have pictured, or exhibitions in which the artwork might have featured at some point. All sorts of different questions that are effectively the artist's CV, which I hope you can see on the slide. And the reason why I've put a picture of the Claridge's fumoir in here is to explain that sometimes the CV of a picture can actually just be things that you notice in daily life, right? So rather than seeing this beautiful William Klein photograph of a woman smoking in a museum, you might have just seen it at a bar you love, or a hotel you walk by, or a restaurant that you've been in, or some sort of local gallery that doesn't normally sell art, or a cafe. And so these types of artworks, I think, develop pedigree from even just daily recognition in places around London or wherever it is that you live. And they can actually be quite affordable to you. Not that most things at Claridge's are, but you get where I'm going with that point. Then there's the subject of editions. And in photography, editioning is a very important part of what we do. And what we try to explain to people every day. But what many people don't realize is that super famous artworks have been editioned, and across sculpture and painting. Rodin's sculpture of the Kiss, for instance, which is a very famous sculpture, is made not only in editions for in the big size, it actually comes in super small sizes as well. Not that those are very cheap, it's just an example. But in every case of editions, it's always important to understand from the seller, how many is too many? How do those numbers of editions fit with other editions across the same medium? Because for Rodin, there could be editions of 200, or in photography, you're trying to limit things to editions of 50, but there are different answers for different people. And do editions offer advantages? So going back to that Picasso owl, most people don't realize that Picasso editioned many types of things. And the word Picasso very often just means, oh my gosh, totally out of my reach. But actually, ceramics and etchings by Picasso are sometimes less than £1,000. So maybe beyond some of your reach, but not completely out of this world in terms of price. And I think that there's also an interesting story to be told about how priorities such as investment versus passion or learning, as we spoke about before, play into a market like Picasso ceramics. Because you, someone with a financial investment perspective has no incentive of buying a Picasso ceramic, which might have been made in editions of, and by that I mean copies of, sorry, I should have defined that before, 200, 250, 500 of the same ceramic owl. There's just no way you can pit two of those things against each other to have value appreciate that quickly. Whereas if you love ceramics, or you love Picasso, or you love owls, and you've got £1,000 as a budget for artwork, that might make a lot of sense. And I'll move on to this idea of also tiered pricing, because that's something that new collectors often find very confusing. Basically, what that means is that as I sell an edition, the availability of the edition from me or from the market decreases, and therefore it becomes rarer and is more expensive. It's the complete backwards logic to the end of season sales that you'll be getting this summer from all of the different retailers. But the logic behind that does actually really work on a conceptual basis. It also means that collectors who really follow artists who have editions with tiered pricing have an incentive to really dedicate themselves to get in there early. So there's a bit of a logic behind that as well. And last but not least, what is the condition of the work that you're considering? And that is also something that I don't believe has a right or wrong answer. Very often when you ask about condition from the gallery, they're also going to use a lot of terms that don't seem to make any sense. Please feel free to ask them what the terms mean, ask for visual examples, and know that sometimes condition issues end up being really beautiful. And I can only give an example that works in photography, but I imagine people that sell sculpture or paintings also have their own favorite condition issues. So I'm going to show you one right now. This is an issue that's called silvering. I hope you can all see where effectively the print looks like it has silver painted onto it. And what that is it's when the silver salts in a photograph become oxidized. And that happens when the print has been exposed to the elements. It's either been too hot or too cold, when there's been a lot of light on it. And so it's something that can be reversed. It's something that can be halted very easily. But it's something that actually I wouldn't change for the world. I think it makes the print much more beautiful. It shows its history and its age, and that it was really made at the time. I realize I'm actually going a bit slower than I intended, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. This slide I'm not going to dwell on too much, because you can always ask for the PDF of this presentation, and this is being recorded. But there is a little bit of research that, rather than asking too many galleries about, you should really learn to do on your own. So I have a little list of websites here. I think reading about the artist is also super important. I mean, there's a reason why this artwork is coming to being. It's because of the person who made it, and that can connect you more intimately with the pictures, or the artworks, I should say, excuse me. But the biggest recommendation I have is really go see artwork in person if you can. Not necessarily the physical thing that you're looking to buy, but other examples, so that you can familiarize yourself with how these things make you feel, what things are supposed to look like, and so that you're not blindsided a bit by what you get as the end result. So I hope that is helpful from before you even get to buying an artwork, all of these wonderful things that can help you learn along the way. But now down to brass tacks, which is the sales process. And there's a short but very important list of questions of things that you should ask yourself before you buy. And I could spend a whole lecture on these, but we're going to gloss over them for now. They're pretty self-explanatory. The first thing, always, is will it fit through the door? And I don't mean the space, I don't mean the wall you want to hang it on. I mean the actual entryway? Will it get around the stairwell? Is the window going to be big enough to fit it in? This problem happens all the time. So I must beg you, please make this first on your list before you buy anything. Is it going to fit through the entranceway? It always ends up being just a bit silly. So please don't don't put dealers in that situation. You should ask yourself also about the reputation, is what I'm calling it here, of the dealer, the auction, or whatever source you're getting something from. I will diverge for just a second, because this is a recent example where a poor woman that I only met about a week ago told me earlier this week, well, Monday, she told me Monday that she had purchased a number of prints, which I immediately knew were fake. She didn't even have to show me what they were. She just told me where she got them from and what she paid for them. And it's a really, really disheartening thing to know that if she had simply asked who represents this artist, who's going to know how many of these things were made, what sizes they were made in, what processes the photographer used, and what the actual retail price of the item was, she might have hesitated before pulling the trigger on these things. So really simple questions that we addressed earlier that come into play. Make sure you feel like that you're buying from the right person, or at least that you've consulted the advice from the right people. The next points on this slide are taxes, import duty, transport costs, insurance, framing, and storage. All of these things are costs that come with owning whatever it is that you're interested in. And especially, again, if you're thinking about the financial angle at some point, realize that the object that you're potentially going to resell is only going to be valued at what you paid for the object, not all of these extra things. So it's important to really have a distinction in your head between the sort of sunk cost on top of what you're actually buying, as well as only agreeing to buy when you know what those other costs are, because they can be very significant. There are cases in which the way someone wants something framed ends up being half the value of what I sold them the artwork for. So do consider those, as well as the environmental risks of where you're wanting to put things. You know, photographs in particular, but pretty much all art are susceptible to the elements. So please don't try to put paintings without a frame in an open plan hotel in Mauritius or on the outside walls of your yacht. It's not a good idea. Real example. And then, of course, the currency and transactions. It's pretty common for galleries to price artwork in a currency in which they might need to pay the owner of the artwork or the artist. So if someone is quoting you something in euros, even though you live in the UK, please be aware that you might not be able to pay in pounds. You might also need to only pay by bank transfer rather than credit card. A lot of these things are in place for very good reasons, and we can expand upon what those reasons might be in the Q&A. So now you've got an artwork and you're wanting to keep it safe. So the next stage is thinking about framing and conservation. I won't go into every single one of these now, simply because it is really a personal choice, and there are plenty of other companies such as a framer who would specialize in giving you advice on these. But really the first two elements on here, if you're thinking of buying a painting or a work on paper or a print, is always insist on glazing in the frame that blocks out UV rays, because that could really affect things over time. And also insist on what's called using archival materials. Generally, if you're using a reputable framer, they're going to already be insisting on both of those anyway. But you can always ask for this presentation and refer back to that. They're both super important for the life of what you're buying. I don't really know anything about the sculptural side of stuff, but I can certainly refer anybody who's got questions about that to specialists who are really good at that. And hopefully that was not too much of a cumbersome slide, but we've got some super, oh yes, bonus if you frame like Elton John. He frames each and every photograph he owns in its own unique styled frame, which if anyone was able to see the Tate Modern exhibition several years ago, you'll notice works super, super well. I realize that's, you know, high level framing at that stage, but yeah, bonus points for me if you decide to do that. So given that we are at the, so we're just passing 6:30. My conclusion is also super concise. And because I used to be in management consulting, I've stolen a business strategy concept that I use for my collecting, and which I hope is helpful for all of you, given that there's many different topics we've already spoken about on the logistics side of things. And that business strategy tool is called SMART. Now, collecting is ultimately about desire. So I sort of combine the SMART tool and the SMART strategy with the idea of desire. And to me, smart collecting is knowing your budget, understanding the availability of the artwork, purchasing without overspending, protecting the artwork, giving as much value to your acquisition as you take. That's where the reading and investment comes in, and offering the best emotional and economic value proposition to you. So that's putting it in the right context, making sure that you're happy with how it's presented, and celebrating the artwork once you've actually put in all of that money that you've put aside for something that beautiful. It's worked for me. I've tried to give that advice to the other people for whom I give this lecture. And, you know, please screenshot this if you want to. It's really the most valuable part of this entire presentation. All of the other details were things that you could theoretically learn out of a book. But the last thing I'll say is that, you know, when I give this lecture at Sotheby's, I have this whole audience of men and women who are looking at me and they say, but Valerie, you've not told me the answer. What should I buy? With this amount of money, what would you buy? Or what should I advise people to buy if you're wanting to become a consultant? And no, of course I don't have that answer. I would be so rich if I had the answer to art collecting. But I do think that there are two pieces of advice I've been given in my career that I find really valuable. And those are that you know, you shouldn't buy what you don't appreciate, i.e. recognize the value of, and that applies to things that you might initially not like. You know, this mentor that I used to work with was really adamant about always reconsidering pictures the next morning if they stuck in his brain. And I think that's a huge testament to artwork and to a collector's eye, is to notice when it really grabs your attention, because with the billions of artworks out there that there might be, for one to really stick out, even if you didn't like it at the beginning, it's so worth considering. And I've found myself falling in love with things I never would have actually thought on first sight would be for me. And the last thing is that actually by accumulating things slowly with consideration over time, you end up giving more value to the individual things that you buy by creating that collection. And that was Juliet Hacking, whose Sotheby's course I lecture to occasionally. And I really think that, just like the Henry Bull collection that I admire so much, I really believe that that's true. So that is it, everyone. Thank you for joining. And now it's time for questions. I hope I didn't speed through too fast.
No, you didn't. It was fascinating. I'm going to stop sharing your screen, if that's okay. I hope it didn't freeze for a second there. It was so interesting. I absolutely enjoyed it. I could listen to you forever. So it was just like, tell me more, please. I want to know everything. How did you find it, ladies? Do you have any questions to Valerie that you are dying to get an answer to? Any personal experiences, even you can just put in the chat box there, and then we can go through all of the questions. So we have one so far. Do you make suggestions / recommendations for storage places that are reputable?
Well, it will certainly depend on the value of the picture. Generally, you know, if it's something that is not fragile and you know, in essence, if you have control over your own big yellow storage unit and it's properly crated by the framer or whoever has sort of kitted the transport outfit for it, it's perfectly reasonable to get your own insurance and to take charge of something that you can handle yourself. If it's a big Andy Warhol, I would say that your top brass that you're going to find on Google, Cadogan Tate, Williams and Hill. There's, I think Adam Smith also has a storage unit. And generally, I mean, the best people to ask would be the auction houses, because I know that they get so much artwork in, sometimes they overflow into secondary storage units. But generally the two that I've worked with over time are Cadogan Tate and Williams and Hill. And they are based around Heathrow. I know Williams and Hill is. I think Cadogan Tate might also have a place in Vauxhall. Still showing my age here if they've moved.
Amazing. We have another one. This is my first ever talk on art, and I know nothing about it. But it was very interesting, and I will listen to the replay and will make a note of Valerie's details for future. Wonderful.
Thanks, Carol.
Carol. Another question, how long should you plan to keep the artwork for before selling?
That is a question that's going to depend on what you've bought. If I were to condense sort of what I think about when thinking about selling, is that's not something we've tackled in this, is timing and presentation are huge. So if you are thinking about selling an artwork you've only had for a year, you might want to ask the original gallery that you bought it from, as well as reputable auction houses, and to see how they would position it. Because there's basically, you should ask the dealers and the auction houses to pitch at you. There is no right or wrong in terms of the length of time for everything, but I would say try to buy artwork you don't want to sell if you can. It's so much more enjoyable, and it's the questions about when you're ready will come when you just organically have grown over time and become a different person with a different relationship to that artwork. Otherwise, promise you I don't have the answer. I'm not just keeping secrets.
Yeah, so Charlotte has some original pieces that were gifted but no idea of provenance. Where would you start trying to find out about the artist? Great question.
Two places, Google and Amazon. Google is really invaluable. I mean, we as sellers will often see just where that artist has been in the press lately. Has anyone with a Picasso been in Architectural Digest? You know, we do use the internet as a resource. If your motivation is to sell the artwork, the first thing I would do would be to email an auction house with anything you know about the picture. If what you're looking for is to develop a further passion around the artworks, then definitely pick up a book. One off-piste recommendation I can give is there are websites out there that if you know at least the name of the artist, you can look up what their auction records have been. And that's not to say that, you know, we're all sitting on gold, but it has happened before. And it's always worth running. Most of these are paid services, but they're not super expensive for a couple of searches. And it might be worth running their names through. Actually, they were listed on that research. You should do your own page. ArtNet, Artsy, Invaluable.com. All of these places are good resources. And last but not least, if you know nothing about it, take a picture of it. Google has an image search function. We have used this before in our industry. We can't know everything. There's a lot of photographs out there, and sometimes Google will get a hit of something comparable at the very least. Or you'll get just a picture of a whole bunch of leaves when the painting something completely different. So,
nice, amazing. Are there auctions you can attend to get familiar with purchasing? And if so, where would you recommend where you are not expected to buy initially?
You know, the smaller value sales generally accept any member of the public. Also, you can watch any auction online. Uh,
Okay.
you generally need to create an account with the auction house, but I'm sort of laughing because it's super fun to do this, to watch these things online, especially when things are going for millions and millions and millions. Yeah, it's a simple account. You don't need to register your financial details. You won't be able to buy or to bid on anything. Uh, in smaller value sales, just make sure that you don't have allergies or a tendency to raise your hand for no reason, and you should be fine. I don't know how things will be going forward with COVID-19. So that might change things, but the online side of it should still be available. And it is really, really fun. Actually, I wish I'd been logged on when the Banksy shredded. I wasn't, and I was supposed
Oh,
to be. It's always worth giving it a try.
amazing. Oh, another one. Any other places to learn more?
Learn more about artists or the buying process. Guessing the buying
Buying
process.
process,
Okay.
probably. The
Um,
buying, yeah.
so so I've spoken about auction houses and I've spoken about private galleries. Um, but okay, so I'll try to keep this to like 2 or 3 recommendations. If you're in a position to take one of these online courses in on the art market, that is a hugely valuable place to do so. You don't necessarily need to get a master's course. There are I think the auction houses themselves provide courses. There are various other kind of online things that you can do with the Courtauld and other universities are only going to be wanting to promote these online part-time courses more and more anyway. But I would say, you know, go to galleries that you like, invite that person out for a coffee. You know, we all need breaks, and my boss is not a fan of, you know, like unscheduled things. So I think it's really valuable to just develop relationships with people, as long as you or anyone is honest about the motivations. It's really rare, I think, unless it's a busy season, to never get some sort of just happy conversation from a dealer. It really depends on the circumstances, but I don't see any reason why anyone should feel that we're these cold ice towers of art and industry, and that we only accept people with their own personal yacht coming through the door. We get student groups all the time who ask us questions. We get new collectors all the time who say, you know what, I'm going to do some reading. I'm going to look at all the auctions and I'm going to record the prices and learn on my own for 6 months and then come to you. And 9 times out of 10, those people learn so quickly that they never end up coming back to me because they've been able to find it somewhere else. So yeah, I hope that's varied enough. Juliet Hacking's book that I quoted at the very end of the presentation, that is a really great book. And yeah, I think it's really, really useful. It's on photography specifically, but a lot of these things overlap. And before, I don't know how many people are logged on. So before I end up, you know, enlisting 20 coffees, the answer to your question, Samantha, is I would be delighted to have coffee. That would be fun.
What are your or who are your favorite photographers at the moment? Or maybe new ones that you discovered recently? Anything, just as a
I'm glad
person?
that you asked that, actually, because Hamilton's has represented a gentleman named Tomi Oseki for about 30 years. Hamilton's has been around for 37 years. It's pretty crazy. The photography market didn't even start till 1979. So, and he has work that I've always had trouble selling because the prints don't reproduce well on screen. We have to remember that our screens are lit, so everything that we look at, whether it's a painting or a photograph, we're looking at on screen and it's glowing at us. And that's not how it works on paper work. They don't glow at you. So his pictures are so detailed and precise, and and just, they're like small jewels. They've got all these facets, and every time you look at them, they're more and more complex. But I hadn't really fallen in love with any until about 2 weeks ago, when I went through a box of his what are called platinum prints. Completely different process than your normal black and white printing, completely different salts in the mixture, the chemistry is different, the process is different. And I am now down $1,200 of my own money for no other reason than the fact that I'd never seen these prints before. And I immediately called him up, and I asked him if he would let me buy one of his pictures, and if we could negotiate a price, because we hadn't actually priced these things. They didn't have a retail price on them at the time. So yeah, it was that was my most recent one. But there are photographers who I think, how should I put this, where I think there's significant opportunity to buy a well-known name for a lot less money than you expect. And that those I think they're few and far between, but there are a couple of them. But it just depends on the circumstance and sort of what people's budgets really are.
Yeah. And Hamilton's been doing virtual. Are you still doing the virtual?
We are. I haven't been posting about them, but the intent is now to do one every 6 weeks in conjunction with our physical exhibitions, because we are back to work.
So how does it work, the virtual one?
They're slow going, and not necessarily from a purchase perspective, but I think there were so many virtual exhibitions that were happening at the very beginning that it was hard to capture people's attention. What's ironic is that ever since we've opened up and business has started to come back, those same viewing rooms are now being used to sell, now that people have their attention back.
Nice.
So
is it like in a way that you have to log on or create your account, and then there are some different viewing rooms, or how does a virtual?
We haven't created a password protected viewing room yet. I think that is something that other galleries are doing. I really believed in a multi-pronged approach, and think if there's anything that COVID-19 has taught the art industry, it's that we need the digital format, and we also need more accessibility and transparency. People want to see prices or ranges. They want to be able to learn on their own time at 2 a.m. when they're scrolling through their phones, and waking up the next morning and learning more, and only coming to you when they're absolutely ready. And it's not, I love the client interface, but I think there are so many people who don't necessarily want to talk to a human being without educating themselves first. And we as galleries, as private galleries who make our living off of selling pictures, need to play our part in the educational process.
Absolutely. We have, I think, one more question. Is it more risky to invest in unknown or up and coming artists? I was speaking to an art consultant recommending I invest in this recently, but I wasn't sure.
There are risks across the board. And this is going to sound like a really non-answer, but it's going to depend which artist, who that artist is working with as well, what kind of representation that artist has. If you're considering an up and coming artist and that artist creates an artwork that in your brain and heart, there's a synergy between the price of the artwork and your love for it, then I'd say go for it. Every collector who's wanting to do this for a long time is going to collect things, sometimes early on, sometimes in the middle of the process, that they want to hide under their bed forever, that were complete mistakes. They don't remember why they did it. And I think everyone needs to accept that that's sort of part of the process in any collection. Think how many times you've done this with an earring that you thought was going to be your favorite earring forever, and inevitably 3 years later you donate it to Oxfam. Art, I'm not wanting to make that comparison in a super flippant way, but I would just say make sure that there's a synergy between what you feel about that artist and the artwork and the budget. And if you have a consultant that you really trust, just make sure that that consultant also has good relationships with galleries. I mean, I think it's a quid pro quo. We're happy to work with consultants that we respect for all the effort they put in and all of the knowledge that they have, in the same way that I think any client should be happy to question a consultant about the types of galleries that they're working with, and the the types of things that they've placed, and to kind of get comfortable with the recommendations that that person is giving as well.
Lovely. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, Valerie.